anything except the detective's expectations. That's the experimenter expectancy effect, which has been demonstrated incredibly well in scientific psychology. But even if you had a rule that said, look, a detective can't say anything to the witness, which I think is a bad rule, it doesn't help. It doesn't take care of the problem, because there still are nonverbal influences on the identification. Pauses, leaning, displays of interest or disinterest. There's a lot of nonverbal ways to influence witnesses as well. Facial expressions. So the answer is, you've got to do these things in a double-blind fashion, where the rule is the person who administers that lineup does not know which person is the filler and which person is the suspect and which are fillers. Now this leads me to something very related and very important, namely eyewitness certainty. And you'll see how that comes back to the double-blind idea here in a bit. Eyewitness certainty. It's not a mistaken identification per se that leads to the conviction of innocent people. Instead, the eyewitness must be highly certain. If the eyewitness is certain and mistaken, which we call false certainty, then that's the dangerous situation. These DNA exoneration cases, when we go back and look at those cases, boy, those witnesses are positive on the stand. Some of them use phrases like, I'm 150% sure. I don't know how people get over 100, but there's how you get outside the rules even of percentages. But so now the question is, and we knew from our early studies of jury simulations that the certainty that the eyewitness expresses is the primary determining factor whether or not people, and by people I mean the detectives, the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury, believe that the eyewitness made an accurate identification. If the witness is certain, and then you're going down. It's just that powerful of evidence. So certainty of the witness matters. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. It turns out that it's not the case, as some secondary sources have said, that, there's really no relation between certainty and accuracy. Actually, meta-analyses, once again, over thousands and thousands of our subject population, meta-analyses collapsing over those studies indicate that, and this is an upper limit, but that the correlation between eyewitness identification accuracy and certainty could be as high as about 0.40 to 0.45. Okay? Now, you have to be able to communicate these ideas to audiences who don't know anything about correlations. So I did an interesting thing, or I think it's interesting, that works pretty well. A 0.40 to 0.45 correlation is approximately the same as the correlation between height and gender. Height and gender, okay, which is biologically determined. I think a height-gender correlation, is 0.42 or 0.43. What that means is, and it's a fitting analogy, because what it means is, here we're trying to use a sort of continuous variable, confidence, that's continuous, to predict a dichotomous variable, accuracy, accurate, inaccurate. And you can do the same thing with height and gender. Here's somebody's height, which is continuous, it could be anywhere along some range, and you're trying to predict, let's say, their gender, whether they're male or female. Well, that you have about a 0.42 or so correlation, 0.43, which means that, if I tell you, for example, here's somebody who's, an adult who's 5 feet 4 inches tall, what do you predict, male or female? Well, you predict female, and you're going to be right more often than you're going to be wrong. Here's someone who's, let's say, 5'11", 5 feet 11 inches tall. What do you predict, male or female? Predict male, and you're going to be right more often than you're going to be wrong. But sometimes you'll be wrong. And the same is true of eyewitness, the correlation between accuracy and confidence. But the more interesting thing is that it's unfortunate that the way that identification evidence is obtained, unlike in our experiments, which is where we got this estimated correlation, the way identifications are commonly obtained in this country leads to ambiguity about the meaning of eyewitness certainty. In other words, it turns out you cannot expect that correlation to exist in the real world the way that these identifications are obtained. And here's why. We're talking about the creation of false certainty. The system is built to create what we call false certainty. Namely, and what's critical here is to keep in mind, eyewitnesses can be influenced even after they've made their identification. For instance, good, you identified the actual suspect after the witness picks out number 3, right? Or witness picks out the one that the detective thought it was, and the detective says, yes, you got him. Happens all the time. It is almost routine in many parts of the country, right? Or, and this is an Iowa case where I first discovered this. This is actually what led me to begin the kinds of experiments that I'm going to show you in a second here, where the witness was put on the stand. This defense attorney said, Professor Wells, how can this witness be so positive in the pretrial hearing? And yet I know she's wrong. I know this is a mistaken ID. And I said, well, I don't know. But when you put her on the stand, ask her what, if anything, the detectives said or did. There were 3 detectives in the room that administered a photo lineup to her. What, if anything, the detectives said or did when she pointed to your client? And so he asked her on the stand, and she said, they clapped. So we wanted to know, what does this mean? What effect does this have on people? And so we began a whole series of experiments, which we are still doing. We've published quite a number of these so far, but it's very rich and interesting. I'm going to tell you about the sort of simple version of these experiments where we stage, where we have people witness something, and then we put together a lineup that they make an identification of. Now, with the data that I'm going to show you right here, the way we did this is they view a lineup in which the real perpetrator is none of them. So, and yet witnesses make picks, so we get a lot of mistaken IDs. And then we manipulate what we call feedback. In other words, the person administering the lineup reacts. We don't care who they pick, because it's none of them, really. Just at the flip of a coin, if they happen to fall in this condition, we say, oh, good, you identified the suspect, right? They picked number 3, oh, good, you identified the suspect. They picked number 1, oh, good, you identified the suspect, depending on how the coin flip came out. On the other hand, if the coin flip came out otherwise, we're not literally flipping coins, we have randomization charts, then nothing is said. Okay? So here we have a simple experiment. The experiments actually have many more conditions in them, but here's the simple 2 conditions that are critical. Then afterward, what happens is we take various measures. By measures in this case, we're asking them questions like you would at trial about the witnessed event. And we're also asking them questions about their lineup identification. Now, keep in mind, this is time going down this way. And so this manipulation, this experimental treatment right here, is occurring after they've already made their identification, clearly after they've already witnessed the event, so it shouldn't influence what they say about their identification or what they say about the witnessed event, right? But, of course, it does, and we call these retrospective memory distortions. So what happens is we ask them questions like, how certain were you at the time of your identification that you identified the real gunman? How good was the view you had of the gunman? These are all questions that you would ask a witness at trial, okay? Now let me show you some results. Now these results, this is a little bit different of a kind of display than perhaps you're used to. I'm not going to show you means because there's actually another interesting way to display these data. This is the percentage of witnesses who, at the high extreme. So this is be the percentage of witnesses, under certainty here, who say they were positive or nearly positive in their identification. And that's important. What percentage were, remember, all these witnesses made mistaken identifications. We want to know what percentage rise up to the point with this false certainty where they would actually get to trial and result in indictment and perhaps a conviction. And then this is the percent who say they had a great view, who could make out details of the face and so on. In our control condition where we gave no reaction, there's about 12, in this particular experiment, about 12% false certainty. I don't know where that comes from. We didn't make it, we didn't create it. These witnesses are reporting that they were positive or nearly positive, and we don't know where that comes from. right? Only about 2% said they had a great view, which is good because we gave them a lousy view. Only about 2% said they could make out details of the face, which is also good because we created a situation where they really couldn't make out details of the face. But what's important is what happens when we simply had reacted to their lineup identification. Now, 50% of the witnesses report being positive or nearly positive. Now we've got over 25% saying they had a great view. These are all distortions that resulted from reacting to the witness's decision, to the witness's pick, right? So here's false confidence, right? Because this is having high confidence in a mistaken identification, and only about 12% of the people are in that situation. Boom, false. Now all of a sudden, 50% are feeling that false confidence. It turns out, also, interestingly, that if you go back and ask them later then, you know, we reacted to, you know, the person who administered that photo lineup reacted to your choice by saying, you know, that you had, now what? We have also disconfirming conditions. I'm going to point out that, yeah, disconfirming feedback lowers the way they remember their confidence. But we asked them, did this influence you? Okay? Did the feedback influence you? And what we find is that some people will say, yes, it did, and some people will say, no, it didn't. But what's more important and more interesting is that when you look at their actual confidence here, what you find is that those who say that feedback influenced them, yes, indeed, look, here's the confirming higher than the disconfirming. But those who say that feedback did not influence them, just as influenced. This is not a significant interaction here, by the way. They are just as influenced. And what we find is that people have, in psychology we say, people have no introspective access to these cognitive processes. They can't go back and report to you exactly what happened. Well, let me finish up by mentioning some things about impact and reform, because, you know, if you let me go, I can go for days. There are over 13,000 largely independent law enforcement agencies in the United States. We are a unique country in that respect to have these independent law enforcement agencies. Almost every country on the face of this planet has an integrated criminal justice system. We don't. We give local control, states' rights, other kinds of things. So we have these independent law enforcement agencies all across the country. The only rules they have to abide by is stay constitutional. Otherwise, they have pretty much free rein. There's no mechanism for creating uniformity or change in that. It's local control. When I worked with the Department of Justice, we worked long and hard. It turns out we can't order these law enforcement agencies to do anything. They're independent. The federal government cannot do that, right? And when we tried to kind of push them, we'd get back this states' rights, you know, local control. Get off of our backs, big government. So that's not the mechanism. And also, change from the outside. This change is coming from the outside, not from within. This change is coming from scientific psychology. This pressure is coming from scientific psychology. That's always going to be resisted. Somebody comes into Iowa State University from the outside and starts telling the university how to do things, they're like, get out of here, right? And so that's the natural resistance that occurs. And interestingly, the legal system has never, to this day, to this evening, as I speak, ever collected one piece of data on eyewitness reliability. Not one. It's all come from scientific psychology. Now, gets a little more interesting. USA Today in 2003, front page article talking about my research and said, you know, these new ways of doing lineups are sweeping across the country. And I'm looking at that and saying, yeah, right. There's just no way. They just are not. To say they're sweeping across the country. But there has been significant progress, and it may be that this kind of statement is more justifiable today, here in February of 2005, than it was in, I think it was approximately February of 2003, than 24 months ago. Things have happened. Reforms have been made in New Jersey. New Jersey was the first. New Jersey's unique. I worked with New Jersey. I worked with all these jurisdictions to get these changed. I worked with New Jersey. It took a long time, many trips out there. But New Jersey's unique because New Jersey is the only state in which there is one person who has authority over all law enforcement in that state. By statute, it is the Attorney General of New Jersey. So all I had to do was work with the Attorney General. And the Attorney General had the power and authority to order this in every law enforcement agency in the state, even sheriffs. Anybody wearing a badge has to abide by that. So we have all these reforms. We have double-blind testing. We have sequential lineups, proper selection of fillers, proper instructions, all these kind of whole package of things. North Carolina now, Wisconsin, the District of Columbia, just recently, just within the last month, the city of Minneapolis, and that's starting to spread. I'm going up there in a couple of days, and they're bringing in people from around the state to look at what they've done. Boston, Massachusetts, I was on their task force, and they made these changes. Other parts of Massachusetts are coming along. Santa Clara County, California, which many of you may recognize as where Stanford is, and so on. Parts of Illinois, Seattle, assorted smaller jurisdictions. This morning's Chicago Tribune article points out, which actually surprised me a little bit, because I wasn't sure exactly what was happening, but the reporter seemed to, yeah, it's picking up much more steam in Illinois. We've gotten some small jurisdictions to do some things, and so this was this isn't the full article. It's actually a quite lengthy article. That was in this morning's Chicago Tribune. Reforms are unfolding in Connecticut, Louisiana, New Hampshire, Houston. Man, if you can get Houston, you can get any place, man. New York and Iowa. Now, why is Iowa just sort of unfolding? I mean, aren't I here? Isn't that, you know? Yeah, that's the way these things always work, right? And furthermore, I don't think Iowa had nearly the problem that some of these other places had. Iowa law enforcement, I think, generally has been somewhat more conscientious about these things. There is much more to be done. Even with all of our improvements to the lineup, there still is an error rate. We brought it down, we're bringing it down, but there still is an error rate. Can we improve this even more? We think we have ways to do so, although they are as yet not fully tested. Our double-blind lineup procedure reduces the rate of false certainty, but notice, even with double-blind techniques or with no feedback at all, no reaction, you still get this false certainty that occurs, natural false certainty. Why is that happening? I don't know. Can we eliminate it? Maybe. We're still working on that kind of question. Composite faces, a big problem. It turns out that composites, whether done by a sketch artist or done with a computer system like we're doing them here, and there's a poster back there describing some of this work, are very poor resemblances to the actual perpetrator. Furthermore, doing composites tends to alter the memory of the witness in ways that is undesirable. Can we do anything about the innocent people? I get letters all the time from people in prison. I can't do anything for them. You have DNA evidence? You don't have DNA evidence. How do I know whether it was a mistaken identification or not? I don't have any magic way to figure that out. Can we do anything about the innocent people who are in prison due to mistaken identification? The portion for whom there was no DNA to contradict the eyewitness. I think that's the most intractable of these problems, and it may be that we can never do anything about that. That those are just lost cases that work their way into the system, and there's nothing we can do about that. I will end there. Thank you very much.
I think Professor Wells would have time for a few questions. Any questions for Professor Wells? Over here.
Where?
To the left. Oh.
Christie.
So what is the probability that a person that shows you their ID, that you'll actually be able to determine from the picture that that's the student?
Pretty low. You've tried it, haven't you?
I can I can get these pictures printed out and I can't find anybody in my class that looks like.
First of all, I share that experience, so not even talking about the research. You know, I'm sitting there looking at, because we have, you know, this great system where we can access students' pictures, and I'm looking at them, and I'm looking at the students, and I'm saying, I can't match any of these. There is a problem, I think, with photographic identifications. You know, it used to be the case that more live lineups were done. And two things happened. One is, but the main thing that happened was the U.S. Supreme Court said in the actually 1973, said, you know, at a live lineup, there's a right to have defense counsel present. And I think for the most part, police have reacted to that by saying, then we're doing photos, because there's no right to have counsel present with photos. So now, and, I mean, that plus technology, is so much easier to do these things with photos. It's easier to select your fillers with photos and so on. Now we're using a lot of photos. And I think that there's some very serious issues with regard to how well people are able to identify someone from a photo. A photo is not a perfect way to do it. And so that's, I mean, it's something that is being looked at, and that is, how much are we losing here by relying so much on photos instead of live lineups, which is really your question, right? Thank you. Any other questions? There's one there.
Yeah, several times during your discussion, position 3, or picture 3 came up several times.
Yeah.
You seem to have studied so many aspects of the simultaneous lineup. What do you perceive as favored position by police or by the witnesses?
Well, it's pretty clear what the favorite position is for police, and that is to put the guy in position 3. That wasn't just my terminology. I remember going into, when I went to LAPD at their invitation of Chief Bratton, they put me into their detectives room afterwards, and I was, and so the guy who does most of the lineups in there, he's saying, well, let's just see if you can tell who the suspect is in this one. And I said, it's number 3. Okay, well, what about this one? I said, it's number 3. He said, oh, okay, yeah, well, you always get, okay, well, let me see if I can find one that's not number 3. And he went through a whole stack, and he couldn't find one that wasn't number 3. Well, but interestingly, we find, with regard to the simultaneous displays, no preferences, which is very surprising, because order effects and preferences, right-hand preferences, left-hand preferences, first, last, seem to pop up in a lot of aspects of things we study in psychology. But we haven't really been able to establish that in this work. Now, in the sequential, that's not true. In the sequential, what happens is, is that we're concerned because, to some extent, because if the suspect is in the first, the first position tends to not get picked, okay? So if the suspect happens to, because the way we're doing these in New Jersey and so on, is that it's randomly determined what position the suspect is in. And so we put in a caveat. Nobody's supposed to know this. But the caveat is that when you do a sequential lineup, the first photo is always a filler, okay? Because we know something different seems to be happening on the first one. But once you get past that, ideally you don't let them know how many photos you have in the sequential. So there's not a last position effect, because they always assume that maybe more are to come. So we've eliminated position effects with the sequential, except in that first slot. So what we always do is there's a filler in the first slot, and it's random thereafter. Thank you.
Who makes the most unreliable witness?
Who makes the most unreliable witness? I would have to say there are three problematic sort of populations. One is very young children. They're a big problem. You can't get them not to pick somebody. Sometimes they'll pick 2 or 3 people. And the elderly. The elderly seem not to do very well with lineups. The other population is not really a fixed population at all, but rather sort of a population circumstance, namely cross-racial identifications. Whites trying to identify blacks, blacks trying to identify whites. It goes both ways. It's a little stronger, this problem with whites trying to identify black, but we also find it with Hispanics, so it's not really race at all. In fact, we should stop calling it the cross-race identification problem. It's more of a cross-ethnicity identification problem. Orientals have more difficulty with whites than they do with other Orientals, and so on. It is your own group is easier to identify than somebody from another group. So that's more of an interaction between populations than the problematic populations.
Sir,
Yes.
you use DNA as your absolute reference. Is there a possibility that you could use things like chemical analysis of inorganic substances and so forth that also could be an absolute measure of guilt or innocence?
Well, I'm not really an expert on the inorganic stuff. The DNA has become sort of the gold standard for certainty, or as near to certainty as we can get. There certainly are, I think, there's a lot of work to be done in forensic science. The interesting thing that I've learned about forensic science, because once I got inside the Department of Justice, I'm dealing with a lot of forensic scientists of various types. The DNA types, the types who do the fingerprints, the fiber analysis, and so on. It turns out that DNA is really the only forensic science that came from science. The other forensic sciences, fingerprinting and so on, were developed by cops. They weren't scientists at all. And they have some problems associated with it because they don't have the research behind them. Fiber analysis, bite marks, handwriting analysis. Handwriting analysis, where you're saying, okay, this person did or did not write this particular document, question documents. Turns out, handwriting, it turns out that, you may or may not know, you can't get handwriting experts into court anymore. Why? Because they've been disproven. It doesn't work. They can't do it. It's a myth. What we need, and the legal system has been screaming for this, is more real scientists trying to develop these kinds of techniques, as opposed to cops kind of making it up. Fiber analysis, made up by cops. Now there has been some progress because the FBI has been trying to, among others, and the Department of Justice has been trying to dangle money in front of scientific groups. And here at Iowa State, in the area of ballistics, there has been some work done to try to make that, it turns out ballistics, that didn't come from science. None of that stuff came from science. A ballistics expert who gets on the stand is not a scientist. They're a cop. And they're looking at things under a microscope and saying, yep, looks the same to me. It's really not science. It's scary, but it's really not science. And we're trying to change that. The Department of Justice is trying to change that. So, I don't know what your background is, but if you have some ideas about establishing identity with inorganic materials, wow, that would be exciting. That would be very important. Right?
You said that government did not conduct any studies of this kind. 2 or 3 years ago, I read in the Atlantic Monthly about a survey of some 8,400 convicted felons who were in prison for rape, and exactly 1/4 of them were exonerated on the basis of DNA evidence. Who performed that study?
Yeah, you're talking about the FBI database where what happens is, I presume this is what you're talking about. What happens is, because a lot of places across the country can't do their own DNA, what happens is they send it to the FBI. And so they're sending samples to the FBI, and about 25% of those samples that are sent to the FBI says, no, that's not a match. Almost all of those cases are cases in which there was an indictment. I'm going to come back to the answer to your question that you were asking, but I want to make sure that you understand where these came from. Almost all of those cases, there was an indictment. In other words, the person was charged, and then they sent the DNA off. So what that suggests is 25% of the time, they're getting it wrong. What would have happened if there wasn't DNA? Those people would have been, there would have been at least an attempt to prosecute them, and many of them would have been successful because, as you perhaps know, 85% or so of attempts at criminal prosecution in this country are successful. In other words, if you're indicted and you're tried in front of a jury in a criminal case, chances are you're going to be found guilty, because that's just the base rate, that's the pattern. Now, those data were not a result, the FBI had the data because but they got fleshed out only because Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, who I also work with out of the Innocence Project in New York, with private money, fleshed that out. The government itself never came forward with that information. And the government still to this day has not released the actual, all those individual files. We can't get those individual files. We've tried. And there may be reasons to keep them private, but so that was not a government study that did that. Yeah, the government had the data, in a sense, because they were the ones doing the DNA test, but they didn't do a study of it, and still haven't done a real study of what you're talking about.
Gary, I think we may have to stop the conversation, probably go on and on, but I want to, in closing, thank Dr. Joffrey for having the vision and for creating this great lecture series, to thank each of you for coming out this evening to attend this particular lecture, but most importantly, thank Professor Gary Wells for this outstanding presentation. Thank you.